All right, everyone, welcome to Tiny Desk Theology Chapter 2 in our Unfold series. We just came out of Chapter 1 talking about God, simple enough, right? Character and nature of God, looking at how do we try to define or at least have some conversations around God that have some kind of sense to it. We last month had a conversation with the Reverend Dr. Eminent Thomas J. Ord, as he told us his title was, and had a great Tiny Desk theology on that, and then spent 4 weeks looking at the character and nature of God during worship. And now we turn to Chapter 2, which if Chapter 1 was titled I Am Who I Am, we now look at We Are Who We Are. And so, Mitchell, this was really kind of your progression, moving from identifying God to then identifying ourselves.
Yeah, it seems the most natural fit, right? So I think we know a lot about who God is by getting kind of serious about who we are and the gaps that exist between us and the divine. I think they're large, but maybe Donna will help us, build the bridge.
Yeah,
so to speak.
So our guest tonight is Donna Bowman, and so we're really excited to have you. Don, will you just introduce yourself for us? I told Tom last month I kind of stopped trying to do introductions because I usually ended up screwing them up anyway, and just like his introduction of the Reverend Dr. Eminent Thomas, so feel free to, whatever you want to title yourself, like he took a good privilege there, so.
Yeah, I can't claim any reverend, but I'll just claim the doctor and certainly not eminent. I'm a professor of interdisciplinary studies here at the University of Central Arkansas in the Norbert O. Shedler Honors College. And my degree is in philosophical theology from the University of Virginia. I work a lot in process thinking, so Tom and I are in the same spaces because he's working in open and relational thought, which is kind of a umbrella term that process fits within in interesting ways. And I have wide theological interests that just kind of follow, I think, whatever is most intriguing in the culture at large right now. And so I'm really excited about having this conversation with y'all.
Well, so Tom connected us, which is awesome. Thank you, Tom. I'm sure he's listening to this currently. But partially, I'd actually had your book that you had written for the Homebrewed Christianity series, and the title is fantastic. And I really want to know where you got the title, but then also what led you to write this book. But the title is Being Human, Becoming the Best Bag of Bones You Can Be. So first of all, where did the title come from? Because that's fantastic.
Okay, good, because I don't have any responsibility for that. The series editor, Tripp Fuller, gave me the name and said, write a book that fits under this title.
That's fantastic.
And everybody loves it, and I have, it's not mine, so.
True to form, though, right? Interdisciplinary studies,
totally.
You just following where the path leads.
Mm-hmm. So why did Tripp come to you to write this book specifically?
Well, that's a great question. Maybe it was because my first sort of publications in theology were about the doctrine of election, and particularly about bringing Karl Barth's magisterial study of the doctrine of election into conversation with process theology, which is a real weird fit. Because for many people, Barth, Calvinism, and process is kind of the opposite. The power of God being preeminent versus kind of God's responsiveness and dependence in some sense on creation in process thought. But I thought that there was an interesting parallel or interesting place we could connect the two, in the sense that process thought emphasizes a primordial decision of God to be in relationship with whatever else exists. In process thought, it's whatever else exists is a necessary world. And Barth also has this, amazing emphasis on God's self-determination primordially to be God for us, right? God for us. And that orientation of God towards the human, I think, might be one reason why Tripp thought that it would be interesting for me to kind of look look from that direction. Like one question about theological anthropology is, how does God see us, right? And the other question is kind of, what can we know about ourselves from the sources, experiences, authorities that we have access to? And so election kind of takes both of those views, right? It kind of comes from both sides.
So if anyone's not familiar, can you give us just the layperson's definition of what theological anthropology is?
No, I'm going to let you guys do that. I mean, theological anthropology is one of the loci, right, of theology. There's a kind of traditional way of doing theology which kind of runs through. Here are all the theological topics, and the doctrine of God's usually first, right, just like you guys did it, and then the doctrine. So the anthropology would be the doctrine of human beings. Like, what is the theological understanding of what a human being is? We could say, what is our nature? I'm too much of an existentialist to want to do our human nature. But like, what does theology tell us about what it means to be human? And I think it's a really interesting way of looking into theology, because for a lot of people, that route into it doesn't really occur to us. It would be more like, here's revelation, here's what God says, here's what we need to know about God. And then the human would be secondary. It would be, given what we know about God, what do we need to be? Or what changes do we need to make? Or how do we get into relationship with this thing? And I think looking at like, oh, what do we know about us? Is kind of a question that a lot of people don't actually think of as a theological topic, but it's a huge one. How can we understand this relationship if we're not really looking at both sides as well as the combination?
I think that would be true about any relationship, right? Like even the kind of like relationships we have with a variety of different people in our lives, the more we know about ourselves, the better and healthier that relationship actually is. In fact, I think you can make an argument that you really truly can't be in the healthiest of relationships until you've done some sort of self-examination. But I guess no one ever really does want to start there, right? That's the hard stuff. It's easier to like look at the other and describe the other or get to know the other than actually do that work on yourself. So this collective consciousness of like not doing it from the theological anthropological space, I think is like totally makes sense. Why we put it down on the ladder, because it's hard and messy and even more difficult maybe than talking about God.
I think so, but I think we have a lot of resources for it.
Yeah.
Resources, expand on that, because I think that's probably true, and probably those resources play into how our understanding of humanity or the human condition or our understanding of human nature has changed over the course of time. Yeah.
Well, I think our biggest resource for understanding ourselves, understanding what it means to be human, is something, again, I learned from Karl Barth, which is Jesus. We have the resource of Jesus. Like we think about Jesus as the revelation of what God is to human beings. But the other side of it is that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. So Jesus reveals what humanity is too. And I think taking that seriously is a real brain exploder for a lot of people.
Right, because it's way easier to be like, but he was God, so that, I can't be like
discount the humanity of Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
Though? Yeah.
Yeah, when we take seriously the humanity of Jesus, a lot of times we start the conversation with the heresies, about the early Christian way of working out, like, who is Jesus? How does humanity and divinity intersect? And my contention is, my hot take is that a lot, there's just so much docetism in the church today. Like almost every Christian I meet is a docetist in some sense. And so you have to so docetism is that idea that Jesus only seemed to be human. And so for most Christians, the God part of Jesus just is predominant. Like that's the controlling bit. And it's fascinating to look back at the way that was talked about in the early debates, because it's kind of miraculous that we ended up with an emphasis on Jesus' full humanity. I mean, that's not like, there's a lot of reasons why that is harder to hold, harder to maintain than some of the other proposals that were out there. So because docetism didn't end up being doctrine in the Christian church, now we have to figure out a way to take seriously the full humanity of Jesus. Not just that Jesus suffered, which was a big part of it, right? Suffered in the human and suffered as God. Not just that Jesus had a real body, but what does it mean for Jesus to have a real body? What does it mean for Jesus to be an embodied human being, just the way we are? And to not think, oh, well, because Jesus was God, he didn't have to deal with the body the way I did. I don't think that's Christian doctrine. I think Christian doctrine is Jesus had the full human experience. That means all the body stuff. That means all the hormone stuff. That means all the emotional serotonin stuff. And once we kind of own up to that, I think it allows us to look for Jesus to really, as a reflection or as a revelation of what our own experiences are. So that's resource number one, right?
Yeah, I love it because so much of Jesus's humanity, even if we focus there, is Jesus somehow overcame his humanity by being without sin, right? So we only connect sin to what it means to be human in the body, right? And so Jesus's humanity is something that he conquers, but not something that we actually explore as just simply existing in human form, right? I mean, we don't talk about what pre-adolescent Jesus would have been like, right? Or we don't talk about what
was Jesus doing under the sheets, or what was
totally.
All those things. Did Jesus have diarrhea?
Right? We don't talk about bodily Jesus at all because we've been, I think, taught so much that the body is a predominant source of sin or potential sin in our life that needs to be cleaned and scrubbed and ultimately shed when we die.
Yeah, right. So that kind of raises another part of theological anthropology that I find fascinating, which is that the emphasis on the resurrection of the body in the New Testament, in the gospel, I think is befuddling to many Christians. Why would I ever want to be reunited with a body? Why would I want a new one? That Platonic idea of it's just a cage for my soul and I'm going to be set free, right? So there's another emphasis of theological anthropology that just has so much to teach us because it is non-intuitive from the ways we've talked about salvation. And once we take it seriously again, I mean, what appears that we've just put on the back burner and haven't been looking at and thinking about?
So I really love your idea of, so we talk a lot about if you want to know what God is like, obviously we're coming out of this chapter 1, I am who I am, look, Jesus is a good place to start, right? As this source of revelation. But I just love so much flipping that on the head and saying, well, if you want to know what humanity is like, also look at Jesus. And it does break down this kind of Docetism aspect. We talked about this. We did a Tiny Desk series on incarnation right around Advent time last year. And I think it's a really profound and obviously glaring thing that's been sitting there the entire time that I've never really pondered that way. But it takes me back to seminary. So when I wrote my systematic theology credo at Perkins, we had a whole 2-semester thing on it. It was a whole thing. But my emphasis was really on
Perkins grads.
I got to bring up the 2-semester systematic theologies at least, once a.
You're going to do it every episode, aren't you?
I probably will, because I need to remind you, ILF people who didn't even take theology, right? You didn't even take a class on theology, did you?
No, none. Exactly. We had no theology class.
That's what I figured. So,
none.
But I essentially because. I think there's 9 loci, right? And I essentially started with theological anthropology and worked my way out because I felt like somewhat as a practical theologian, right? I was doing, I think, either youth ministry or college ministry at the time. And I had just seen so much of the effects of the idea of totally depraved. Like, can I cuss on here? I don't know. I think I actually put in my one of my papers, like, if you tell people that they're a piece of shit long enough, they'll believe you. And then they act that way, right? And so, like, I felt like it was really important work to start doing the theological breakdown to show that, like, no, we're not. That's not who we are at our very core of our being. And start unfolding that and looking at that. And so looking at humanity through the lens of, like, what does Jesus communicate to us about what it means to truly be human, starts getting then at this idea of capacity and what is our human capacity, which then takes us back to the Augustine Pelagian controversy and that whole mentality. And, like, I think we can get real nerdy on that, and I want to a little bit. Like, I don't want to totally overlook that, because I think it plays an important role from, however many 1700 years ago or whatever. Like, it's still playing out now. So I welcome your thoughts on what capacity really means for us.
My guy, Karl Barth, like, one of the things that made him famous is his famous, response to Emil Brunner, who had said, there's got to be a point of contact in the fact that we're creator and created, right? There's some kind of metaphysical, or at least, historical, there's a connection there. And Barth says, nein, right? That's his famous response. It's like, no point of contact. And so that idea of, like, what do we have a human capacity to know God, to be in relationship with God? Why does Barth say no? Barth says no because the forging of that connection is pure grace. It is not given in any structure that we could assign to nature or to necessity or even to history. It's pure grace. It's pure, gratuitous, miraculous God reaching across the infinite qualitative gap and forging that relationship. And but then you look at it through, and he sees that in Jesus, right? Like, Jesus is a miracle because Jesus has that relationship, both sides in one thing. But it's just as much of a miracle when it happens to us, right? So when we think about human capabilities, which definitely is a topic in theological anthropology, that's a big Rubicon we got to decide if we're going to cross. And I love the way Barth does it, and I'm inspired by the way Barth does it, but I can't go along with him that, that relationship is not somehow metaphysically given. I want to keep the emphasis on grace and miracle and that, all that stuff I love, but the power of simply existing, and simply existing in a way that cuts off other possibilities for what might exist, right? The facticity of creaturehood points to a capability that extends backward and forward in time. That we arose out of relationship, and that tells us something about what relationships we simply can't avoid, but we have the power to shape. And I think we have so I'm a dirty Pelagian heretic, 100%.
I was the heretic in systematic theology because they were like, oh, Phil's the Pelagian. And I was like, I'm at least semi-Pelagian, but I might be full on.
Listen, I think we've got good company. I think it's kind of impossible, practically speaking. Maybe there's some really amazing theologians who have, like Calvin and Barth might be good examples, who really are able to hold that as a practical reality in their heads and act as if that's the case. I don't think that's true for very many people, just like I don't think it's really possible to kind of hold a orthodox doctrine of the Trinity in your head and act as if that's the case, think as if that's the case. It just is not an actionable an actionable theology. And so I just embrace the other side of it. I'm like, okay, human beings are agents. We're agents. I think that's one of the things you kind of can't not think you can't think without that thought. And I think it's true to what, again, we see revealed in Jesus. It's true to the way the Bible talks about human beings throughout. I think it's only the theologians and that get in their heads, and the philosophers, they get in their heads that it's impossible for agency to be distributed and shared on a metaphysical level. It has to all be located in one place.
You are preaching all the things I love right now.
I love to. I'm always telling students, embrace your heresy, man. Like,
totally.
Name and claim your heresy. If you can't think without it, you just got to really own it.
Okay, I love it. And so I feel like though we have to at least then talk about what role sin plays in the midst of. So one thing to say, like, what does it mean to be human means to have agency. I think that's one thing we would at least somewhat definitively say. And yet, like, sin plays a role in the midst of this. So what role does sin play in your understanding of what it means then to be human?
Okay. So sin is whenever I start talking about sin, I think about the Andy Griffith Show, because there's the episode where Barney falls asleep in church, and he wakes up just at the end of the sermon, comes out of the church, shakes hands with the minister, and says, "That's something you can never talk enough about, sin." And the sermon was not about sin, but he thought he was on firm ground in assuming it was. It's one of my favorite things. So we got to talk about, sin. I mean, it's just always there. But but what is it? What different views of it do we find in the Bible? I was just talking with students about the Gospel of Mark today, and one of their questions about it was like, when the people come with the people to be healed, and they ask, about the role of sin in this person's life, and Jesus forgives sins, and Jesus says, go and sin no more. And what is he talking about with this sin? That doesn't seem exactly to be the sin that I always assumed was being talked about in church, like doing bad things. And we've got all these metaphors. Sin is missing the mark. Like, all my students have all heard that one, But I think we have to think about sin in terms of our doctrine of salvation. So Jesus definitely comes with a different view of what sin is than what the people around him are intuiting from the scriptures. And his different view of sin seems to me to be something about the scope of our understanding of each other, or the scope of our viewpoint. Is sin something about the individual? Is it something about our family? Is it something that you can kind of tell from the outside that people have sinned? We read Job right before this, right? And so that's what Job is all about. I can perceive sin in the results in your life. But then the wisdom literature all says, I look around, and the righteous are suffering, and the wicked are being rewarded. I can't perceive that reality of sin in the results in people's lives. And we really want to do that. We really want to be able to point out sin. And what Jesus comes to say in a different way is sin is whatever separates you from the community. And to heal it, all you have to do is welcome people back into community. And you can decide to do that. We can decide to act as if sin does not have the power to separate us from the community. Right? And I think what Jesus comes to say is that God has decided to act like that, and yet y'all are still acting like it. Y'all are still acting like there's some kind of irreversible separation from the community that can't be overcome. And God has decided to act like that's not the case. Right? And so living in the kingdom, living in, the imperial rule of God, living in whatever you want to call it, means acting as if sin has no power to separate us from each other. All the things we think do are actually don't have that power. We can decide to act as if that's not the case, because that's the way God acts towards us.
Yeah, I love that definition. I often say sins in our life is when we've just simply made ourselves the center of our own world and universe, and the fix is always just focusing on others and on God, and it's not really that complicated. Doesn't mean it's not hard to do, but you can I imagine we can kind of move back and forth between these spaces all the time, right? We can be one who welcomes folks into community 1 minute and then do something that separates folks from community the next, without even being totally aware of how inconsistent we are in our pursuit of God and loving neighbor.
Yeah. So, I talked like it's so easy. We just act as if, we're not separated. But, Mitchell, you bring up that my personal experience of sin is self-regard, is limited perspective. So I tend to look at what do I need to be saved from? What is holding me in bondage? That's another kind of way to think about it. What's holding me in bondage? And it's a little hard for me just to decide to have a wider perspective. I need help with that. I need to be given a wider perspective. And to be given something that I don't have the complete agency to get for myself, well, there you have an essential role for God in my salvation, right? My process thinking is that all of us are in all of us have limited perspective, and by tapping into God's perspective, we get a much wider sense of how we affect each other and how we have the potential to affect the world. And again, this is very personal and existential to me. That's what I felt I needed to be saved from, and so that's kind of become an emphasis in my thinking about it.
I think that's a really important piece, because often what I hear of as people either deconstruct or are trying to figure out and make sense of a more open and relational theology, or kind of deconstructing sin, really is what is the purpose of Jesus, and what is the purpose of the cross? And so I think redefining it in that way and having viewing about salvation through that lens is a really great invitation to start to rethink and maybe unpack some of the theology we may have carried for a long time, even though we aren't really sure we want to carry it anymore. Yeah.
And I think the some of the things that keep us in bondage actually turn out to be illusions. And so there's a lot of understandings of sin that pile those things on top of people. And so I think a real robust examination of, kind of going back to first principles and thinking about those definitions can really reveal that we're, being held down by ghosts sometimes.
So you said you don't, you kind of put quotes around human nature and said you're more of an existentialist. And so I am curious, because I talked about the idea of how so often it was a practical theology thing for me, of kind of getting rid of this idea of total depravity and stuff. So when you think of the human condition, or whatever you would say that might be, and if you want to define that, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. But where do you start with the idea of if human beings are created good, human beings are created, totally depraved, or is it like a blank slate and there's just a whole lot of influence that's taking place on either side?
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly, I think just looking at the practical consequences of an idea that human beings are created with some flaw or some necessity to inevitably go off the track. I mean, that view has a very harmful track record, I think, in Christian history. I sometimes really shock students by kind of talking about the Calvinist resurgence these days and kind of some of the logical positions to which they find themselves led, and the idea that little babies deserve death just as much as all of us do is just, at some point, I think I talk to students a lot about non-negotiables. That is, intuitions they have, moral intuitions they have, that even if God himself spoke that into existence that they were wrong, they wouldn't be able to let go of them, right? And I think some of these consequences of a total depravity Calvinist view, really, we have to shelve those moral intuitions, those independent moral judgments, in ways that I think do harm to not just others and that might hear those teachings, but to our own, again, our agency as creatures that can access independent moral judgments. So if you want another theological stake, I would put down, it's that we have an independent moral capacity which is not crippled and corrupted, but we have the ability to think through those intuitions and trust our own formed and educated judgment about those things. That when people, students are so harmed sometimes by the thought that this seems just wrong to me, but I'm being told it's right, and I guess what seems wrong to me is just messed up, and I think that's just tragic. And it also leads to kind of authoritarian things that are terrible. So yeah, where was I going with that?
Well, and I think it totally just discredits the idea of the Imago Dei, and as we've talked about Danielle Schroyer in her book Original Blessing. She's been a part of our community and come and spoken before, but it ends up what she says in her book. It starts at Genesis 3 and kind of almost just disregards Genesis 1 and or 2. And why do we let sin be the defining characteristic in not only the beginning, but also the climax, and almost it feels like the end of the story. Well, luckily Jesus comes in to save us in the last minute, as in that story. But why do we give sin so much power in this narrative, and just disregard this idea of the beauty of the original creation story? It blows my mind that we've let that garden story, which I think is interpreted in a terrible way personally. But we can come back to that in a minute if we want to. But why is that the story that so many people still cling to? Why is it the predominant message right now? And I say right now, I know it's not just right now.
Yeah. I'd love to hear Mitchell's thoughts on why that's the dominant message right now. But history has a lot to answer for. And it's a contingent history, though. It could have been otherwise. That's kind of one of the things that people really wake up to once they start studying this stuff, is that the emphases we have inherited did a few changes, like a butterfly flaps its wings, and suddenly we're not in that world where that's where Jonathan Edwards is preaching that, in American history, and that evangelicalism becomes the inheritor of some kind of sense of we all are on the brink, needing to be rescued from Satan, or Satan's power over our lives. Now, that is not to say that people don't experience real bondage to something and really experience a feeling of rescue. I've done a lot of reading in the last few years with students of Marie Griffith's book about God's daughters, about charismatic women, feeling in bondage to their marriages, feeling in bondage to the notions of family and submission and so forth, and or about addiction studies and recovery studies and all of that stuff. Now that can play out in harmful ways, I think, as well, in things like conversion therapy, where what's identified as what you're in bondage to, again, might be something you could decide to embrace instead of feel like it's oppressing you. But that sense of there's something that I need to be saved from is a defining feature of how we think about our humanity. One thing that students say to me all the time is, listen, if we're so great, then why do we need salvation, right? If we don't have a problem, like you're taking away all the things that I think that I've been told are problems. Like, what's salvation for then? And I'm like, salvation is for empowerment into a wider capacity to do what humans can already do, right? To act in a way that takes advantage of what's unlimited about God, rather than just having to act in a way that is constrained by what's limited about human beings.
I also think we're, maybe, I think there's a natural space for us to also focus on at least the kind of collective sin when we see a world that just sucks so bad.
I was waiting, Mitchell, for you to get to this question. Like, why do we just suck so bad then?
Yeah. But I mean, I think like there is something, like it doesn't take us very long to get to a place where we're like, this is not working, right? Like we are failing to, as a group, live into the reign of God, the kingdom of God here and now. And like, it seems pretty self-evident that we're collectively missing the mark all the time, right? And so I think that really goes more to like, what do we do with sin and evil? Like, where's the distinction there? I'd love to get your thoughts on that, Donna. Like, how do we define evil in the midst of sin? Does evil exist when we take a definition of sin that is maybe more freeing and less limiting?
Yeah.
What do we do? What do we do with evil?
Okay, I'll talk about what I think is the actual original sin of the Christian institution. The original sin of the Christian institution occurs between Galatians and 2 Timothy. And it occurs when the view of what Jesus brought to us is, let's live in the kingdom of God, where there's no Jew or Greek, where there's no male or female, where there's no bond or free. Let's live as God sees us through Christ, rather than as the world sees us. And Paul's not, completely consistent on this, but at his best moments, he has that beautiful idealism and that beautiful vision of what that can be. And then we get to the pastoral letters, and all of a sudden it is live in such a way that nobody can find offense with you. And what that means is, don't cause a scandal. Don't be radical. Show how respectable you are. Show how upstanding a citizen of your, Hellenistic city you are. Have that status in your community that everyone will think that this group of people meeting in a house, they're great. They're no threat to anybody. And like between those two moments, that's where the structural evil comes in. So, that's the fall for me of the Christian church is where, being thought of as a good force in society became important. And because that's when women can't talk anymore, and that's when that's where it happens.
A good force as opposed to like a revolutionary force.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. And it's not like Paul wanted, people to, now it's John of Patmos in the Revelation that's all about, listen, you gotta completely, stand against the terrible beast-like society you live in. You can't give into it. Paul's not about that. But he's not at that loggerhead yet. But he's like, listen, we're gonna, we're going to treat each other. Listen, I'm going to send greetings to the women leaders of the church and the male, and I'm going to treat everybody like I think God sees them, and we'll let the chips fall where they may. And then the pastoral letters, it's all like, oh man, if we keep inviting people to be deacons that aren't respectable members of the community, horrors, what will people think, right?
I mean, they allowed me to be a deacon, so I guess there's there's something to be said there.
That's true. For sure. Well, you did have 2 years or 2 semesters of theology.
Luckily.
That's what I
2
understand.
semesters.
Yeah.
That's what we hear anyway.
Well,
you'll hear it again.
I think that there's tons of times in Christian. We were talking about Christian history earlier. We could talk about how anthropology changes through Christian history, and there's always these moments where there's a possibility to completely go into that radical space, and then it always gets crushed by institutional respectability. And if we want to talk about sin, we could talk about how the sexual abuse scandals of Christian institutions, from the Catholic Church to the Southern Baptist Church to wherever we want to go, are all infected with we can't let this get out. We can't let people know. We'll lose our social respectability. And so we have to treat people as if they were subordinate to the institution of the church. And it just absolutely is crushing. There is sin for you.
Which the irony is, to give institutions a small benefit of the doubt, I think part of it clings to this notion that it's the best way to evangelize.
Absolutely.
Which actually turns out to be not true, because it's the least authentic way to evangelize. And people have gotten really good at seeing through the bullshit. And so I think the church is at a pretty important crossroad here on how are we going to maintain or not even maintain, are we going to try to maintain our status and basically just do what we've been doing better so that we can be kind of scrubbed up and look professional and clean and enter into all these new budding emerging spaces? Or are we going to atone and seek for forgiveness for the things that we've failed to do and actually do things differently to ensure that the church has, a new way of being in the world? And I think that the institutions always are going to win out. And I say that as an institutional guy, right?
Yeah. It's just,
I get a pension and a health insurance from an institution. I like institutions on some days, right?
When you said, that irony, that the claim is always, let's keep this in-house because otherwise it will destroy our witness. And if your witness isn't the actual truth, what the hell are you doing? And I just find that whole thing so revealing. It's
idolatry. It's idolatry.
100%. If I were more of a young radical person, I would say that I'd be one of those people who's how can we do church without an institution? I'm not sure it's possible. Institutions have advantages. They allow for things to be sustained over generations. These are sociologically good things. But boy, oh boy, the effort it takes to safeguard against the institution becoming, again, the thing that's worshipped, the thing that's preserved, and not people, is so mammoth. I'm not sure anybody's ever able to do it.
Yeah. Donna, what is your faith history?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so I was raised Southern Baptist in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in what for then in the 1960s and 70s passed as a mega church. We had our services on TV. We were that that size, and I when I went to college, I suddenly found that people were talking about the Bible, especially in a way that I had never had they were talking about it in ways that weren't Sunday school, and it was like very confusing. Like, how can people know this different stuff? Like, where does it come from? So I figured I had to study it. In the process, I'm a cautionary tale. In the process of getting a religion degree from Wake Forest University, I completely lost my faith, and kind of, wasn't interested at all. And I thought Christianity was all crap. It was all BS. And it wasn't until I went on to get a graduate degree after a few years at the University of Georgia that a wonderful professor and scholar by the real name of Will Power, that was really his name, said, well, all these things that don't make sense about the omniscience of God, the omnipotence of God, the omnibenevolence of God, all the things that like you can't reconcile. What if what if power isn't what we think it is? What if knowledge isn't what we think it is? What if we apply kind of a different set of assumptions to it? And that completely was the same as like looking at the Bible a different way. It was like, oh, there's a different way to possibly think about that historical inheritance of the characteristics of God. Is there a different way to think about the historical inheritance of the characters of human beings? And that gave me a way to re-embrace my own Christian, which heritage and upbringing, which could totally, I feel so, I know it's necessary sometimes for people to turn their backs on a part of their life and just say, I can't accept that any of that still forms part of me. I define myself over against it. And I get that happens to people with religion. But I feel really lucky that I was given an avenue to re-embrace it and to just understand and love the Bible, and love hymns and singing, and love the metaphors and the imagery of the church and the kind of the terminology of it, but just have a new kind of base standpoint from which I'm interpreting all those things. So I'm an Episcopalian now. Like I have so many recovering Baptist Episcopalian friends.
And it is very opposite end of the spectrum, right? I mean, in a lot of, I love stories of faith being reclaimed, but the reclaiming of that is often like if you ask someone from your home church, like, what do you think of this now? It would be discussed, right? I don't know that, but I'm assuming like there are plenty of people that come out of, this religious kind of identity and claim a new one, even though it, has all the trappings of the old one, uses the same terms, and they can't understand how or why. Or, I was part of a small community in Denver where we had a lot of folks when I was in seminary that were rejected by their, small Reformed denominations. And it was almost worse that they were practicing a form of Christianity that was so offensive than if they would have just said, I don't believe in God anymore. Like that is something that I think, that people could work with. But the fact that like you ended up in like or folks end up in a denomination that looks totally different and does a whole lot of different things and holds different doctrines and polity and all of that is just like, I don't know why we get so offended by that stuff. And I guess it would be the same, like if someone left White Rock and started going to First Baptist downtown, it would repulse me. Right. So like, I guess it's like into this space of like tribalism and things like that. But I don't know. I just always love the stories of people finding an opportunity to like reclaim their faith for themselves, really, and through exploration, deconstruction, but also like there has to be a community welcome folks in, which is like the best part about it, right? And I don't know, it just reminds me that we have still just a ton of work to do because there are people that need or are seeking a community where they can like breathe a little bit.
Yeah, I was just working on a lecture I'm giving tomorrow about religious liberty to our first year students. And one of the points in there is, students always ask me, why do people within the same religion fight over, things? And why is that so vicious? And why do we get so passionate about what they consider minor things? And my answer to that is the error of someone who is close to the truth is far more vexing than the error of someone who's far away from it, right? And to allow the error of someone who says, listen, it's all the same except like they got this one thing wrong, and that's pretty important, right? Or maybe it's not even important, but you have to fight that error really hard, because otherwise people will get confused. They will get confused about most people just consider themselves, most of my students just consider themselves like, they don't consider themselves a denomination. They're just Christian, right? But everything about just Christian is so specific, right? It's all,
totally.
It's got a heritage, and it's got like things you reject and things you embrace. Yeah. And like people who do part of that but not the other, they are just like, they'll just gnaw at you, right? They're gonna lead some people astray because they're so close, right?
Yeah. I think it's a good point. Yeah, and everyone can kind of scrub their kind of lineage or faith history of like names and theologians, but they all derive from some source, right?
Yeah,
so like,
I just,
there's no really anything called a non-denominational church.
It's part of my crusade is like, my students are all telling me I belong to a non-denominational church. I'm like, there might not be a name on the sign, but they are doing you a disservice by not allowing you to understand where this came from, by pretending it came from nowhere, by pretending it's just what Jesus taught.
Just the Bible.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's just the Bible.
Until you read the about like what we believe on their website, and it's all the exact same things. Yeah.
Yep.
Literally, it feels like they just copy and paste it, just like pass it around, right? Yeah. It's all the exact same stuff. Yeah, it's always a church that has some like very generic like nature theme, like wellspring or
Four Winds,
life tree or Four Winds. Yeah. So I like that crusade. I'm a big fan of the crusade on roundabouts, Donna. So keep up the good fight in Conway. Arkansas's capital of roundabouts.
It is.
Maybe the South. Can we say it's the South?
There's a lot of roundabouts in the South these days. I mean, there's places that are really just going after it whole hog, and I have a whole presentation about why roundabouts are good. That
the efficacy of roundabouts.
If y'all leave this stream open too long, I'll be sharing it. So be careful.
I love that.
Intersections are sin. Structural sin. They harm people. They hurt people.
They do. They do. Then that is true.
But if you start introducing people to roundabouts, they're going to get stuck in this continual loop of just going in circles, and they'll get lost there.
No, then they get to choose. They can just choose to exit whenever they want. You can actually just keep going in a circle if you want. You can do that. It's not illegal. You can stay right there.
You're giving humans too much credit, Mitchell.
I mean, seriously, I'm not even joking. But the thing about roundabouts is there's no authority telling you when to go and stop. And so it gives you agency, and people hate that, man. They hate it.
Technically, the only person telling you to go and stop is just the community itself. They're just saying, like, you can enter now or you can't,
oh
right?
My gosh, we just wrote a whole theology of roundabouts.
My favorite part about the roundabouts in Conway, Arkansas, is that for a while, though, to get people used to it, at least the one behind Hendrix College, there were stop signs put up. So just to like kind of
ease you in,
stop people, because you can't. I mean, it can be confusing for some if they've, the first time you encounter a roundabout.
See, so that big one behind Hendrix College is a wonderful showcase, because they actually elevated the street and created a pedestrian underpass. And so it's like cars and walkers coinciding in the same space, but not coming into conflict with each other. There's something, again, we could do a theology about that. That's beautiful.
The kingdom of God right there.
Yeah.
I'm down for this. All right. We'll talk roundabouts next time, Donna.
Okay, Donna, so if people want to find you and the continued work you're doing on bags of bones and how you can be the best bag of bones, like beyond that book, what are other things you're writing and where can people find you?
Okay, so my current projects stem around material culture and theology and kind of ordinary theology, lived theology. So I've done work on people who make prayer shawls and what kind of theological meanings they find significant. I've done most recently work on the people who made pussy hats for the women's marches in 2017 and the people who made masks for the pandemic at home. And interviewing those people and trying to see what meanings hold significance for them and what theological significance those meanings might have for us. So
Awesome.
that's my work right now. Going slowly, but I got a lot of material to work on for the rest of my whole career. You
got a lot of adolescents who are looking to you, emerging adults, right? Who are looking to you for guidance too. So you got other things.
I got a few people to teach, but that's great. People can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Donna DB.
At Donna DB. Okay.
Yep.
That's awesome.
We're really grateful for you being here with us. Thanks so much for taking the time and for explaining so many
fun.
just, wonderful, profound, and yet
Thanks
so
for
simple.
letting me just go off the top of my head and talk about things I'm really passionate about. I know we strayed far away from the straight and narrow, but that's what I love to do.
Straight and narrow. There's no such thing. We're too existential beyond that. All right. Thanks so much. Appreciate you.